What can Australia actually do to reduce its dependence on foreign oil and increase its resilience in a world that is becoming more unstable? The war involving Iran is once again putting global oil supplies at risk. And for a country like Australia, that matters more than most people realise. Australia relies heavily on imported liquid fuels, much of which originates in or passes through the Persian Gulf. And if that supply is disrupted, the country has only a limited number of days before serious economic consequences begin to emerge. That is precisely what we're going to explore in today's episode of Climate Mundial's Energy and Climate Weekly. In a previous episode on this channel last October, I outlined Australia's dependence on imported liquid fuels, both crude oil and refined products used across transport, aviation, maritime industries, and also defence. The key issue is that Australia's fuel reserves in the event of a disruption are very limited, generally estimated at somewhere between 25 and 40 days, depending on the fuel type. And in the current geopolitical environment, that raises a very important question. Is that really enough? Much of the oil that ultimately reaches Australia originates in the Persian Gulf and therefore must pass through the Strait of Hormuz, a well-known choke point that has been the focus of repeated geopolitical tensions. And with the current conflict involving Iran, the risks to that supply chain are no longer theoretical. They are real and they are also immediate. So even if a full disruption does not occur, the situation highlights a structural vulnerability that Australia has been living with for some time. At its core, liquid fuel security comes down to two things. First, access to crude oil, and second, the ability to refine that oil into usable fuels like diesel, petrol, and aviation fuel. And on both fronts, Australia faces challenges. Over the past 2 decades, Australia has significantly reduced its domestic refining capacity. Today, only 2 major refineries remain, compared to around 20 at the turn of the century. That means Australia is not only dependent on imported crude oil, but also on imported refined products. So if Australia is to improve its resilience, it needs to consider what options are available, while recognising that each of these options involves trading off. In energy policy, there are always 3 competing objectives: cost and economic efficiency, reliability and security of supply, and also environmental outcomes. And it is very difficult to improve one without affecting the others. One option is to develop Australia's unconventional oil resources, particularly oil shale. Australia has significant reserves which could theoretically provide decades of supply. However, extracting these resources typically involves hydraulic fracturing, which has raised environmental concerns and faced strong opposition within Australia. So while the resource does exist, its development is far from straightforward. A second option is to expand domestic biofuel production. Australia already produces large quantities of feedstocks, but much of this is exported. Redirecting some of this feedstock towards domestic fuel production could improve resilience, but doing so would likely require policy intervention and could disrupt existing export industries. And importantly, biofuels alone are unlikely to fully replace conventional fuels. They would need to be part of a broader mix. The third and perhaps most critical element is refining capacity. Without sufficient domestic refining, increasing crude supply alone does not solve the problem. But rebuilding refining capacity in Australia would likely require significant government support, as global competition has made local refining less economically attractive. In other words, improving energy security in this area is likely to come at a cost. So when we look at the options available to Australia, there are no simple solutions, only trading off. Increasing domestic production, expanding biofuels, and rebuilding refining capacity could all improve resilience. But each comes with economic, environmental, and political implications that need to be very carefully considered. What is clear, however, is that the current geopolitical situation has brought this issue into sharper focus. The question is no longer whether disruptions are possible, but how prepared Australia is if and when they occur. So what do you think? Should Australia take stronger action to reduce its dependence on imported fuels? Or is the current system sufficient, even in a more uncertain world? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. And if you found this analysis useful, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode of Climate Mundial's Energy and Climate Weekly. Bye for now.